Looking at the moment at a devastating ecological crisis, a financial crisis, and potentially we have the opportunity to really catalyze a huge shift in global culture and consciousness.
As a species, we evolved through crisis. I don't think we would have left the sea if it hadn't been some sort of crisis in the sea.
This is a window of opportunity, a time where we can learn how to work together to make such a thing happen.
All right, so this is Mike Sygula from truththeory.com, and this is Truth Theory Podcast episode 5. And my guest today is Daniel Pinchbeck. He's an American author and thinker. His books include Breaking Open the Head, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, How Soon Is Now, and several other books. Daniel was featured in the documentary 2012 Time for Change. He co-founded a web-based magazine called Reality Sandwich and Evolver.net. He's the co-founder of a non-profit educational organization called Center for Planetary Culture. He has written for the New York Times and Rolling Stone, and he participated in rituals with different groups in South America and Africa. So Daniel, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Thanks really for taking time to speak to me today. I've been looking at your work for the last 10 years, and I really like the fact that you dig into so many different disciplines, and you look at both sides of the coin, which is, mainstream science, and then myths, paranormal mysticism. And you also take part in rituals, and you kind of like to test things yourself as well. So I think this is like a really important, if you want to investigate anything, you need to look at both sides of the coin and then probably try it out yourself. So maybe you could just start by giving us a little bit of background on what you've been doing for the last 20, 30 years for those of our listeners who might not be familiar with your work.
Yeah, sure. As you mentioned, my first book, Breaking Open the Head, came out in 2002. Before that, I was a journalist and an editor of a literary magazine, and had a crisis, kind of an existential crisis in my late 20s. Remembered my psychedelic experiences from college at that point. I started to reinvestigate them, and they were really not being talked about much in the culture, in the mainstream. So, but I had some friends who, I had one friend who'd been working with ayahuasca, and he told me about ayahuasca, and he arranged for me to take a ceremony in New York. In the Atticus bookstore in my neighborhood in New York, I learned about Iboga. Because I was a journalist, I was able to get assignments. So I went to Ecuador finally to do ayahuasca with an indigenous community called the Sequoia. And I went to West Africa, to Gabon, to visit the Bwiti tribe and to take Iboga in one of their initiation ceremonies. Then I also visited the Mazatec Indians in Mexico, which is where the mushrooms were rediscovered in the 50s, and worked with them a little bit. And this became the genesis of my first book, Breaking Open the Head, which was basically an overview of all these different visionary compounds. But I also looked, so I described my own experiences with them as a journalist and an explorer. Then I also looked at the whole history of the modern world, modern West relationship to visionary experience, how we had kind of demonized visionary states and intuition, looking at the Inquisition, when we burned all the, witches and wise women in Europe, and how we, kind of assaulted indigenous cultures, which maintained an awareness of these other states of consciousness and so on. And so that book came out in 2002, did quite well. That led me to write a second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, which came out in 2006. Doing the first book, I learned that many cultures, many of these indigenous cultures that used visionary plant sacraments as a method of kind of learning about the cosmos, also had prophetic knowledge or their traditions around the time that we were in now, which they saw as a time of transition or transformation. And particularly the Hopi in America talk about this being the tradition of the fourth world or fifth world. There was a lot of focus on the Mayan calendar, which ended a long count of over 5,000 years, like December 21st, 2012. Some prominent Western psychedelic thinkers like Terence McKenna and Jose Arguelles had also become very focused on the Mayan perspective on time and consciousness. And McKenna had a vision in the early 70s where he felt that 2012 was going to usher in this new world reality. Jose Arguelles studied the Mayan calendar and wrote a number of books like The Mayan Factor and Earth Ascending, where he also looked at that. So that became kind of the basis for my book 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, where I integrated and synthesized a lot of material from philosophers, thinkers, indigenous cultures, ancient civilizations, and my own experience, and put forward this idea that, yes, we were going through this transformation as these cultures had prophesied. I didn't necessarily think that anything staggeringly amazing was going to happen at or around December 21st, 2012. I thought it was a longer process. I'd hoped that there was going to be this great awakening of the modern Western world into the fact that we were on the wrong path, and that we would then realize there were aspects of indigenous culture, their practices around sustainability that we needed to take more seriously and integrate. And I made a film kind of based around these ideas, 2012 Time for Change, 2010. I also started a movement through the Evolver network, where we had like 50 to 60, 50, 70 local groups, mostly in the US, but also around the world, developing kind of communities based on transformative practices and cultural ideas, ranging from local currencies to permaculture to shamanism. But I also got a lot of negative blowback, attacks in mainstream magazines. I was kind of blackballed from the mainstream because I took the ideas of the psyche and esotericism very seriously, and Carl Jung, all the stuff that even now you're really not allowed to talk about very much in the mainstream. So after that, I was looking at beyond the esoteric and philosophical ideas around this transformation, what would we actually have to do on a material, technical level to avert our own civilizational collapse and extinction due to the acceleration of climate change and the many negative impacts that we're having on the different planetary systems. A good model for that is the planetary boundaries model from the Stockholm Resilience Center. Where they look at 9 planetary boundaries that we can't cross without endangering ourselves. We've already crossed 3 of them and are looking at crossing several more of them. So those include things like ocean acidification, climate change, species extinction, atmospheric pollution, and so on. That led me to write How Soon Is Now, which was kind of an effort to apply the kind of psychedelic visionary mindset that I'd gained from the first 2 books to these kind of practical solution-based approaches to system change. And so in that book, we looked at kind of 3 levels of change, or 3 most significant areas that we would have to change, being the technical systems, the social systems, and then the sort of collective consciousness. And then I proposed the ways that we would have to change in those areas. The technical systems actually being the easiest, and we note that we have to go to renewable farming, regenerative agriculture, renewable energy, et cetera, discontinue plastics, reverse ocean acidification, kelp farming, and so on. Difficult thing being the social changes that we would need, because at the moment our economic system really enforces a short-term profit model and are very consumerist oriented. And then the last being consciousness, which is constructed by media, education systems. So I finished that book in 2017, I think. Since then, I have another book that came out on ayahuasca that I wrote with a woman anthropologist, Sophia Rockland, as an introduction and overview of the global ayahuasca phenomenon, looking at the history of ayahuasca and what's happening to it today. And then most recently, I started a course, just posted a webinar, Building Our Regenerative Future, which is at regenerativefuture.net. And that course takes kind of 6 areas of focus and kind of looks at what is the change-based, solution-based paradigm in each one, and how can we integrate that on an individual and collective level.
You said about Mayans and Hopi as these two cultures that talked about this time of transition, but do we know about any other cultures that referred to this period? And do we know anything about the timeline or how long it might take, what's going to happen? Because even if you don't believe in any prophecies, if you look at what's happening on the planet, whether, we're definitely heading towards some kind of outcome disaster, and it's something that might take a couple of years. Or even if you take into account exponential growth in technology, futurists talk about singularity in the next 20 years, where we're probably going to merge with technology. So on many different, from different angles, you can see we're going through some kind of transition, even if you completely dismiss prophecies. So do you know anything about how long it might take, how it's going to look like, what might be the outcome? Are you familiar with?
Yeah. So first of all, I would say that believing in something and dismissing something, it's a very kind of limited mindset and very dualistic. I mean, I don't believe in prophecies, but I think that they are kind of archetypes in the collective psyche that we can explore, and we can just see if they mesh and match with what's actually happening, and then try to figure out if they do seem to mesh and match with what's actually happening. How could that be the case? Why would that be the case? I mean, is it possible that societies can have precognition of future events? Is it possible that individuals have that? It does happen. If you had a society that was focused on developing not just rational and technological capacities, but more like psychic and intuitive capacities, could that lead them to have a better type of precognition, around things that might happen even in the very distant future, a different way of understanding time and space and the nature of reality. So from my perspective, there seems to be a lot of good reasons as a hypothesis to think that some of these, prophetic ways of understanding our reality have value. And I really, also in 2012 got very involved in the works of Carl Jung, who, saw the world from a psychic perspective, and believed that there were kind of archetypes in the collective psyche that constellated over time. And that among those archetypes, there was the archetype of the apocalypse itself, which is a word from the ancient Greek that means the unveiling of the hidden thing, the revealing, the time when all the hidden gets known, and so on. And Jung believed that we were actually in that period of apocalypse, of revealing, and it had to do with the change that was happening through the nature of the psyche. So I bring that up because that's the Western, Judeo-Christian monotheistic worldview. Then you have these indigenous cultures, like the Mayan, which the Maya and the Aztecs with these calendars seem to be the most kind of temporally predictive, in that they're actually creating a kind of time frame when they're saying 2012 in our linear calendar was the end of a cycle, and now we're entering a new cycle. I've been very interested in the work of a Nahuatl Aztec shaman lineage holder, Sergio Magana, who wrote a book called The Dawn of the Sixth Sun. And from his elders and his tradition, he found that they talk about this period of 2012 to 2021 as a transition period between the fifth sun and the sixth sun. Each of these periods being 5,000, 6,000 years or whatever. But the age of the fifth sun was a sun of light. It was a time that was marked by an interest in clarity, rationality, logic, material analysis, science, and so on. As we're moving into a sun of darkness, that's kind of this polarity between suns of light and darkness, the focus begins to shift towards the psychic. And reality itself becomes increasingly dreamlike, increasingly like a waking dream, and becomes more subtly, psychically malleable and available to influence in that sense. So I find that a very fascinating perspective. Then we have from the Eastern traditions, we have the ideas of the Yuga cycle, the Kali Yuga, Hinduism, talks about, sort of a golden age, silver age, bronze age, and iron age that were actually in the sort of last period of the Kali Yuga. Although you can look at that from different ways. Some of the traditions say it's still many, many thousands of years to go. Some of them say that we're almost at the end of it. And you have the kind of Western, kind of traditionalist thinkers who've been, of the 20th century, who've been kind of absorbed by the far right in US and Russia and Europe, like Rene Guénon and Julia Sygula, who said that we were really approaching the end of the Kali Yuga with a total disintegration. And this whole civilization based on materialism and technology was an utterly wrong direction and was going to totally collapse. And it was unclear from their writings whether that meant kind of the end of the human species in this cycle and then a reincarnation in some other cycle, or if enough of humanity would survive to reconstellate, and eventually we would have the Sachi Yuga, the golden age again, where knowledge would be restored and we would be back in a correct relationship to the divine and the spiritual forces.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you look at Hopi's prophecy stone, it actually shows two paths. One is that you see a person with a stick, so it kind of symbolizes living to the old age, and then the other one is ending with some kind of zigzag, which symbolizes the end. So I think it's kind of up to us if we're going to have some kind of negative or positive outcome. It's interesting also what you said about.
Yeah. I also, I looked into the prophecy stone a little bit, and there's good reason to not have a lot of faith in the authority of it. But that's another issue. But it's very hard with these areas because how do you ascribe authority? We know how to do it in a rational scientific framework, but it's much harder in some of these other areas. But from what I remember reading, this was a number of years ago now, there were good reasons not to accept the authenticity of the prophecy stone.
No, I mean, like for example, when you say that apocalypse means actually revealing, right? Which, if you look at what's happening with the internet now, it kind of allows us to see things as they are, like, which is first time ever in history. So for example, someone like Snowden or Julian Assange can reveal information, or you have, I don't know, police officer abusing their power, and suddenly next day everyone knows about it online. So internet kind of gives that level of transparency where, it's harder to hide anything really. And I would say this kind of, could be the meaning behind, something like, just characteristic of this transition. It's like, everything comes to light and, more revealing. I'm also, you said something in the past that reality in a way depends on our perception. And this is something, what I've been thinking about for a long time. So you give this example of when you were investigating crop circles in England. At one time, you took a friend there and he was open-minded, and you would discover some really sophisticated patterns. And then the other time, you would bring a couple who were completely skeptical, and then the crop circles you discovered were actually looked like hoaxes. So it's almost like the intention of the person influences, the perception, or like if they investigate something. What do you think about it? Like, maybe you can talk about it a little bit, because this is kind of what I've been thinking about as well. When I talk with a lot of people who are like maybe skeptics, I feel like whenever they try to investigate anything paranormal, mystical, any myths, they always kind of find the information that confirms, their perception. It's almost like it fits into whatever they want to see. It's kind of, you can look at things from both sides. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that I mean, yeah, I mean, what you wrote, you kind of expressed what I wrote about in the book, so that was my perspective. That, reality is shaped on a much deeper level by a kind of like set and setting. And while that becomes like, crystal clear to us, like during a psychedelic experience, when the psyche is kind of amplified, it also seems to be the case all of the time, And yeah, I mean, look at the way like the Daily News constructs reality. They're focused on a set of things that are happening, but they're not focused on, the pattern of the wood grain on this table, for instance, or the life of ants or a butterfly, outside my door. I mean, we're choosing a very selective focus, and then we build our reality constructs always around that. In that sense, as humans, we're always living mythologically, and we always have to, based on a narrative that we've defined and framed, and therefore we have to be really careful, more careful, I would say, about what narrative or what frame that we're constructing for ourselves. Because if you're constructing a very narrow and reductive frame, you're gonna live in that world, and it's going to be very unhappy, probably. I mean, we see that with this kind of constriction of reality that's happening, around the world, with this kind of conservative movement and stuff like that. So yes, then you can play with this question of to what extent does reality, kind of sculpt itself, according to your, beliefs and perceptions and conditions, and then also, I mean, it gets into many philosophical questions that I explored in the 2012 book, even around like free will and determinism, or the paradox of free will and determinism. The more that we think that we have free will, and we explore that, eventually we actually discover that we didn't have any free will, which is kind of what's, or there's an inherent paradox there, which is what, the Eastern traditions talk about, that, if you think on an ego-based level that your actions are, totally your own, then you're totally confused, that actually there's one consciousness that's constructing this whole illusion of this.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of teachings that talk about this idea that everything is kind of one consciousness, just expressing itself through different points of view. And if reality is created by this consciousness, same way like we create dreams, then it would kind of make sense that your perception might be influencing the outcome, or things you see. I actually, what's your view about consciousness? What do you think? Do you believe that everything is collective mind, or more materialistic scientific perception that's created by brain?
Yeah, I mean, the material or the physical universe is the creative expression of a kind of, probably a singular consciousness that explores its own capacities by, creating all these diverse scenarios and individuals,
Yeah.
Yeah, and then beyond that, there's there's that realm of consciousness and separation. Then there's kind of the realm of the kind of nirvana or the void, which there is a one psychedelic substance gives you a very direct experience of that, which is the 5-MeO dimethyltryptamine, which is extractable from the bufo toad in the Saharan desert, and if you smoke 5-MeO DMT, you have an experience of a total ego dissolution into this ecstatic, non-duality realm of pure whiteness. Of it's purely bliss. It's purely euphoric. There's actually no ego. There's no you that can actually experience it. So you only remember it when you come back out of it. So I find that the 5-MeO DMT is experiential confirmation for what Eastern traditions talk about as the void or nirvana or whatever, and that actually the tantric tradition is that nirvana and samsara are the same thing. So although we have this perception that we're living in this realm of separation, or what they call samsara, actually it's just like a kind of effervescence expression of this nirvana or this void.
I want to talk about your experience in Brazil, one time where you actually took ayahuasca, and you believed that you had Quetzalcoatl kind of sending messages to you. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, once again, you're using this word belief, which is it's always like has to be used very, very carefully. I mean, I definitely had an experience where I had a voice that announced itself as other than my own. I was speaking within my head, starting during this Santa Daime ceremony and then continuing off and on for a week, in and out of ceremony and dreams and so on. And that voice in this kind of transmission that I then wrote down announced itself to be Quetzalcoatl, this archetypal god form of Mesoamerican myth and cosmology and so on. And this type of event has happened, repeatedly through history, where prophetic type people, visionary type people go through a inner experience of a voice from outside speaking through them. And it often leads to like religion starting or occult movements. I mean, Muhammad had the angel Gabriel speaking with him. Moses heard the voice of God about the Ten Commandments. Aleister Crowley, spoke to I can't remember what it was called, but the book of the law came from some Luciferic deity that he connected with. So first of all, just on an anthropological and sociological level, it's quite fascinating that these types of events that we see through history are something that can be replicable, in our contemporary society, like this type of visionary perception. I mean, Julian Jaynes wrote a book about the origin of consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind, where he talked about how people originally may have experienced their consciousness or their sense of self as a voice from outside that was speaking to them or through them. So first of all, it's a very profound experience when this happens, and in the visionary transmission, I was told that I was part of this prophecy. It definitely had in some ways a very humbling, humiliating almost effect on me, but in other ways it was very ego inflating. I didn't really know what to do with it, and I felt maybe I was supposed to be a martyr or a messiah for a while or something. I mean, a lot of people have these types of psychedelic experiences all the time, where they come away with the sense that they're meant to change the world or change reality or something. So I did have the experience. I contextualized it in all the stuff that I was studying in the book. I can't say this is valid. This was actually this. I don't even know what a god is. This archetypal energy. Whether it was part of me or something outside of me, but it's certainly an extraordinary experience. When it happens to you, and it's quite amazing. This type of experience is actually available to us, through
I remember you mentioned something about the voice mentioned your date of birth, 666. Can you tell us a little bit? I didn't get it. Like, what was the meaning of it?
Sure. Well, this idea is that we are going through the apocalyptic end of time. Or the end of a certain kind of time, let's say. I mean, historical time, has a history to it, right? Like, there were times that didn't have history. I mean, Egypt didn't have a linear history. We had this idea of progress, that kind of developed in the Christian era, Roman era, let's say, with the Roman calendar and the Gregorian calendar. And we have this idea that we're in this time of history and progress, moving towards something, the singularity or the last judgment or something. So in the Gregorian calendar, my birthday was, June 1966, which is 666, on the Gregorian calendar, if you look at it in a certain way. And what I was, told during this transmission is that this was actually, a sign of the legitimacy of this transmission. That that I was somehow connected to the whatever it's called, the great beast in the Book of Revelation, the 666. And actually when you look at 666 historically, I mean it's actually interesting because that, there is something called gematria, which is kind of the effect that certain numbers have on the psyche in an unconscious way. So like, Fox is actually 666, right? Like, by gematria, F is the sixth letter of the alphabet, O is the 15th letter, 1 plus 5 equals 6, X is the 24th letter, 2 plus 4 equals 6. So Fox actually in gematria stands for 666. So, I mean, and did that just happen? Is that, how does something like that happen? Was there a satanic sorcerer behind Fox News who knew about gematria? Or was it just random?
No, it's, I'm also kind of interested in numerology. And for example, the Great Fire of London was in 1666, which was, like 4/5 of London were burned completely. So it was like almost the whole city was destroyed. So it's again like, even if you think about like 9 being the highest number and 6 is the opposite in a way, and like the destruction of London, for example, could symbolize, like destruction in general. So I was curious, and also, you yesterday shared your phone number, and it also had 666. So it's kind of like, it's interesting symbolism, for sure.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I've had a lot of 666 symbolism. Yeah, and I'm not even a big believer in numerology, to be honest. It's not even like a big interest in that.
You said something that tools we create are reflection of our shadow side. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, technology is a projection of consciousness. It's a projection of the psyche at a current level of development. And as we haven't, integrated our shadow or reached a certain level of integrated wisdom or knowledge, our technologies automatically come with a flaw or a fault. So, for instance, like plastic, must have seemed like the greatest thing ever, when it was invented, maybe in the 20s or something. You can make anything with it. You could, it's so malleable and so on. But we didn't think about the fact that it was going to end up in every ecosystem, that it was going to end up in our own cells. We didn't even know, up until, look at Facebook, like make the world more open and connected. Yet we're not thinking about how that can be utilized to manipulate people's, unconscious and get them to believe in dangerous, conspiracy theories and destructive ideas, and even allow them to, come together, and act destructively and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's and when we make a tool, as a tool making and tool using species, we make a tool, then the tool exists outside of us, and it kind of reflects our consciousness back to us at that level of development. Then we can iterate on that and make the next tool. So but unless, and that's why the shadow work, the integration of the shadow is so important. If we're going to avert our own, extinction as a species, we would have to do a lot more shadow work, integration of the shadow. And frankly, I'm not even sure that we are going to be able to, avert our own extinction at this point. But something like, for instance, the coronavirus, COVID-19, it seems to me the evidence was highly probable that it was created in a virology lab in China. The lead researcher in China had been studying gain of function on viruses, looking at taking coronaviruses from bats and adding HIV elements to them to make them more communicable to humans. Chinese military had a huge interest in bioweapons as the future way to conduct asymmetrical warfare, creating bioweapons that could target particular ethnic groups and so on. This is also kind of, and the way the virus has moved through the world, it does almost have like a black magic component or something so kind of ungraspable about it. Mutationally, keeps changing, and what are the death rates? What are the symptoms? I mean, it feels like we're being. It's in a way, I would say maybe that is also expressing this kind of murky consciousness of this sociopathic technocracy that is making things that shouldn't even be made to advance an evil agenda. So yeah, at the moment, our capacity to make technologies that are destructive, whether we mean them to be destructive or not, has far outstripped our ethical abilities to sort of command and master technology, and our kind of capacity to integrate our own shadow so we don't project it into the tools that we're making.
Or another way of looking at coronavirus, if you believe it just naturally came from a bat, is that planet just decided, need to stop us from doing what we're doing because we're messing things up too much. It's like creating some balance, or about Gaia hypothesis, where planet is almost like a self-regulating system to preserve life, and then we are kind of disrupting this balance. So it could be this defense mechanism to stop us, or at least slow us down. And then obviously, if we don't listen, it can get worse over time as well. So, it's obviously, you can look at it from different angles as well. I wanted to ask you, what's your view on synchronicities? You talked about that as well. We experience synchronicities in life. What do you think is like the mechanism for synchronicities?
I really like, I think it was F. David Pete wrote a book called Synchronicity, The Bridge Between Mind and Matter. And synchronicities reveal that this, the dualism between mind and matter, or the psychic and physical, is actually not something that exists in reality. And they're like little clicks that reveal almost like a piece of the puzzle or something. That remind us that we're in something that's like a dream movie, dream story, dream characters in a dream play, and but then you can actually have to think about how to work with synchronicities, because not every synchronicity is a sign that you're meant to do something. Sometimes they're warnings actually, or sometimes they're showing you the wrong path. So part of our problem, and indigenous cultures and cultures like Tibetans kind of understood this nature of psychic reality in a way the West totally forgot. And as we've been rediscovering it, partly as a result of the counterculture movement since the 50s with psychedelics and other esoteric practices, we're still quite naive about the psyche, and it's hard for us to kind of just make a discernment between the mystical, spiritual, the psychic, the paranormal, the ambiguously psychic, the benevolent psychic, the malevolent psychic. So actually, now that when these things are reemerging in the contemporary psyche, they need to be explored with much more care and precision. And that would also be part of what I was talking about with the age of the fifth sun, the beginning to realize that the psyche is becoming more predominant again, but then we still have to use our rational faculties and our intuitive and imaginative capacities to understand how the nature of reality is shifting us.
I'm also curious, you obviously tried different psychedelics, you had all these different experiences. If you would have to pick like the most interesting, most profound one, or any kind of psychic experience you ever had, maybe you can just say what happened.
Well, honestly, there's so many, and obviously wrote about them in depth in the book, so people can actually totally go through my process, through studying that. But and I've also been on a little bit of a break for a couple of years from going deep into the psychedelic realm. Although I actually realized that psychedelics had some negative effects on my psychology and character development, doing them in kind of unprotected ways or hedonistic or festival ways. They kind of, unfortunately had some, but it's important to realize that, because now the psychedelic kind of movement is always talking about the value of these things, and they do have tremendous value, but like any powerful tools, they also have a dark side that needs to be evaluated and understood. But some of the, ayahuasca has been like probably what I find most profound. There's so many. It's hard for me to answer a question like that. I've had all sorts of different experiences. I've had, paranormal and occult experiences, but I kind of sometimes think they're sort of they seem kind of they sort of diffuse when you try to speak about them, and you have to be sort of sometimes the books maybe are the best way to encounter those experiences because I was able to really contextualize them really properly.
One thing that is always on my mind when you are in visionary states and you see entities, and sometimes people see the same entities, for example, do you think that these are just visions, or you are actually tuning into some reality where these beings exist? There's one interesting story of Aubrey Marcus. He's the founder of Onnit supplements, and he was talking about this dream he had one time where this demon appeared in his dream and told him that in 2 months he's gonna die, something like that. Then he woke up the next day, he's checking his calendar, and the demon gave him a date, and then when he looked at his calendar, on that date he was actually drinking ayahuasca in South America, somewhere in Peru. And then when he went and took part in the ceremony, this 2 months later, after the dream, the same demon appeared in the ceremony and tried to kind of like do some trade with him and things like that, save a person in his family and trade a soul with him, something like that. So it's kind of like you have the same figure appearing in your dream and then in your vision few weeks, few months later. So I'm just kind of curious, do you think, are we actually tuning into other realities, or are these things just hallucinations and things happening in our own minds?
Yeah, so once again, all of that is put in this kind of dualistic framework, which says that there's like a real and an unreal and so on. There may be different layers or levels of reality. There may be subtler dimensions of reality that are just as real as this dimension, but we can only experience them in certain states or in certain moments. So. And there may be forms of consciousness that exist in ways that we don't quite understand as of yet. In higher dimensions, for instance, and interact with us, in their own way, for their own purposes.
What's your view on time wave zero theory? You're familiar, right, with?
Yeah. Well, in a way, it was kind of busted because he thought the singularity was going to occur right on December 21st, 2012. But I would say, I mean, I wrote about it, his work and Jose Arguelles' work in the 2012 book. And I think that both of them were feeding into this archetype, of the end of time, of this, mutational break into a new structure of time consciousness. In that book, I looked at it through the philosophy of the Austrian thinker Jean Gebser, who wrote a book called The Ever-Present Origin, who kind of believed that we were on the verge of a mutational break into a new structure of consciousness, what he called the integral or the aperspectival, breaking free of the previous structure, which is called the mental rational structure, which has a certain way of perceiving time as a kind of linear extension similar to space, but that actually was a distortion or deformation of time. So yeah, I think that McKenna and Arguelles were beaming into this archetype that is actually something that's happening. It does feel like we're moving towards, one way or the other, the collapse of this civilization, this way of conceiving time, space, and matter, and something else is emergent. For me, McKenna is maybe a little too focused on the technological aspects of the singularity. I think McKenna prepared the way for Kurzweil and this whole idea of the technological singularity, which you mentioned earlier, that the culmination of human history is going to be the merger of man and machine. I tend to disagree with that, partially based on the work of Rudolf Steiner, who was one of my great heroes, was a visionary who talked about how kind of this rational materialism was its own kind of occult force that was dragging humanity in a certain direction towards a kind of imprisonment in technology and rationality and dualistic, binary thinking. So I feel that rather than a singularity, which is also what I wrote about the 2012 book, what we should be looking for is a multiplicity, an opportunity for people to live in all sorts of different ways. I mean, some people will probably go full technological, but you may have other people who want to go back to living in psychedelic communities or having telepathic seances.
Yeah,
Totally
when I think about things like Neuralink, for example, the project that Elon Musk is working on, which is this brain-computer interface. So, like, the idea is that you will be able to communicate through just using this technology linked to your brain, and if you think about it, they say that the person who would be using Neuralink could be accessing information much faster than everyone else, maybe even have extra memory, translate languages, have all sorts of things like that. And then when you think about it, even if you think this is optional and something that some people might decide to do, if the person who's using this technology is becoming, 10 times more productive or 100 times more productive, then in a way it would force other people to use it as well, because, let's say your employer prefers a person with Neuralink rather than someone who doesn't use it. So it's kind of like you might think it's optional, but it might force people to use it the same way, like, you want to have a job today and you might feel like, I don't want to use a smartphone, or I don't want to use internet, or I don't want to use computer, but it's kind of everyone almost is forced to use these tools because of like this effect. So, and then if you look at, for example, what China is doing with full control, facial recognition and all these kind of things, if, for example, Chinese population would have this kind of device installed where, every kind of thought or emotion can be controlled by some single entity, that becomes pretty dangerous as well. What do you think about this whole thing? Like,
Yeah, to me it sounds like hell on earth, basically. I mean, that's a form of hell, I think. I think there's some, first of all, we should, begin to question productivity. What are we producing and why? What's, we're going to produce more toys for Walmart, or we're going to produce more distracting video games. I mean, we are, consumer capitalist civilization has had this mania for productivity, and kind of now we're kind of reaching the end point where, people are being just treated as kind of disposable because automation is coming, and I think partially what's happening, in the U.S. is the sort of exploitative financial elite capitalist class really doesn't see any value in people, in most people. I mean, they're willing to just have them X'd out by a virus, or be unable to have their homes, and be driven to the streets and so on. I mean, Elon Musk actually just made a very revealing tweet, which I think reveals his mentality to a deep degree, but also the mentality of many people in Silicon Valley and the tech world. He had said something. Actually, I can pull it up. So Elon Musk said another government stimulus package is not in the best interests of people, in my opinion. Somebody wrote, you know what wasn't in the best interest of people? The US government organizing a coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia so you could obtain the lithium there. And Elon Musk responded, we will coup whoever we want, deal with it. You know, I think it's a profoundly revealing moment, actually. I mean, underlying the rhetoric of technologists that they're doing good for the planet or whatever is this completely sociopathic, extractive, exploitative mindset where we need the resources for some other country to continue our technological dream. Then we're just going to have a coup. We'll do whatever we want. That's been this whole view of American exceptionalism, American power. And now I feel that's beginning to fall apart, with it becoming so obvious what these mechanisms are. So, what's the alternative? The alternative is to get away from this productive, quantifying mindset and recognize that, what's valuable is what's not quantifiable, but the qualitative aspects of living and being and experiencing, whether that's cultivating yourself through tantra or through art or through love or through community or through family, or through food, it's a turn in a different direction, away from just productivity in itself. But we would really like, I believe, is a world more like Oscar Wilde talked about in his book, in his essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, that I wrote about in my book, How Soon Is Now. We talked about, what would be great if we can create robots and machines that can take away all the drudgery that people have to do, like going into mines or cleaning toilets or whatever. Let the robots do all this crap, and then what are people going to do? They don't have to work so much anymore. They can be focused on cultivated leisure, cultivating themselves, exploring consciousness, and get out of this hyper productivity, linking your brain to the computer so you're going to have faster information. I mean, it's
so what do you think is going to happen? Let's say things are going to go the way they are. We might lose maybe 30-50% of jobs over the next 20 years or something. Do you think that like universal basic income is the answer? What would you propose as a solution?
Yeah, I mean, those are not the biggest problems. I mean, the biggest problem is that we're actually on the cusp of bringing about our own extinction, because we've now almost baked in 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise above pre-industrial levels, and that could happen by 2030. I mean, Siberia just went to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Europe was 1.4 degrees Celsius warmer last winter. Essentially, what we need right now is a planetary mobilization on the scale of what a country like the U.S. did at the beginning of the Second World War, or a mass mobilization around shifting to a regenerative model based on regenerative farming, renewable energy. Basically, we need to reapply our technical creative capacities and our capital resources to make the planet sustainable and thrivable for humans in the future, or we're not going to continue to exist as a species. And unfortunately, we're in a time crunch for that most people are not really acknowledging yet. So for instance, the Amazon rainforest, many people now, scientists are now estimating, unless we strenuously protect it right away, while we massively reduce CO2 emissions, the whole Amazon could collapse as a functional system within 3 to 10 to 15 years. The Amazon is the hydrological heart of the planet. It determines the patterns of rainfall around the Earth. If it goes, the planet becomes much drier, much quicker. What's going to happen is we're going to start having, we're already going to have famines and droughts this summer, partially because of the coronavirus response. But we're going to have a much, much less inhabitable planet within 10 years. And yeah, I mean, universal basic income, getting resources to people so they can survive and sustain themselves while we get all hands on deck to bring about a planetary-wide transition of humanity towards a regenerative system. That's kind of what we need to do right now. I don't know how we get there. I know that the financial system and the government, the political system are all locked into this current
Yeah, I
path.
mean, I think the
That's
problem
what
also is
we
that
need
a
to
lot
do
of
to survive.
politicians, if they're in the office for maybe 4 years or a short period, they kind of think short term, because restructuring everything might take quite a long time, a lot of resources, and they are still profit orientated, and they think, I won't be around here in 5-10 years, so let's leave it for someone else.
Well, that's where they should look at the very good evidence for reincarnation. Things like Ian Stevenson's book, where biology and reincarnation intersect, where he looked at hundreds of cases of spontaneous past life recall in early children, and then was able to track some of those cases back to the past lives and the villages where they lived before and so on. So, if it is the case that it's not just a nihilistic materialist universe where your consciousness is totally integrated in the physical system, and once you die, it's the elimination of soul, spirit, will, everything else, feeling, memory. If consciousness is more of a non-local phenomenon, if we're kind of like these aggregates of impulses that continue onward after death and maybe seek to incarnate in some other form, then this destruction of our physical environment, for those people who are in positions of power who aren't doing anything about it, that's going to have extremely deleterious negative effects.
What was the name of the book?
Incarnate in the future.
Okay.
Ian Stevenson. I wrote about it in the 2012 book. Professor Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. I believe it's called Where Biology.
What's your view on
2008.
Gnosticism and like this whole idea of some kind of illusion and control system by archons? A lot of people talked about it. Some people say that this, like people like David Icke talk about reptilian beings. These are the archons as well. What's your kind of idea?
Well, I recently wrote a short book, long essay called The Halt Control System. I was looking at UFOs and extraterrestrials in relationship to some of these Gnostic ideas. And, it's one more framing. I mean, once again, I think we have to be careful. But what I find problematic with David Icke is that he's very literal about his idea that there are these like reptilians and shapeshifting. But I think the Gnostic perspective that there are demiurgic intelligences that are influencing.
No, I mean, just for people who have no idea about this stuff, maybe you can just give a little bit of background. What is Gnosticism? Like just like very in a nutshell.
People think that Gnosticism was a heretical sect of Christianity, but actually the Gnostics were the inheritors of a lot of the mystery school wisdom in the pagan tradition. And they did understand Christ as a kind of avatar. There's a book called the Gnostic Gospels. They found all of these kind of Gospels that were left out of the canonical Bible when the Bible was put together in the 4th century or something. And I guess they took a bunch of the Gospels they decided not to include in the Bible, and they put them in a jar and hid them in a desert cave, and then they were found, I think, in 1943. And they tell a much different story, many more mythological variants of the Christ myth. And so what we gained from understanding is that the Gnostics saw a kind of, they had a whole cosmology around these beings called the archons, who were kind of created a false reality, sort of demiurgic reality that we were trapped within. Very much like The Matrix, actually. The Matrix films were very much like a contemporary retelling of the Gnostic mythology, but from a technological perspective. Jacques Vallée is a ufologist who developed the thesis after many years of study that these aliens and UFOs were kind of like a control system that were kind of at the periphery and perimeter of human consciousness, kind of controlling our capacity to understand or to think clearly and so on. Yeah, so I mean, it's a very big subject and a lot to go in there, but people can check out my book, The Occult Control System, more my perspective
So
on it.
any new things happening this year for you, like new projects, new books? You said something, you have a course now. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so people can go check it out. We're now setting up the automated version of it. It's www.regenerativefuture.net, or the course is called Building Our Regenerative Future. And we're going to do other courses also. We're still trying to figure out exactly how to develop. The first course was very successful. We had eight sessions. We covered 6 topics: food, health, community, culture, economy, and consciousness. And we had speakers, presenters in each section, and essentially tried to kind of clarify what the alternative model, the alternative paradigm is. So, and also making it very practical and solution-based. So how could people participate in the local food movement or in the local economy movement? Or how could they, what are some of the legal structures they could use if they want to create a community, like a land-based community that could use a community land trust models and so on. So yeah, as we develop it, the idea will really be to have the thing where people have different levels of resource, different levels of time, capacity, where they can really come into something and be like, oh, like now that I've really understood the regenerative model, that this is really the only hope in the future, then I can think about what I have in terms of my resources and my skills and how I best fit in to help in bringing about this alternative, because if we don't bring about an alternative like this, there's not going to be a future for our children or grandchildren. So actually, I see that this has great capacity to.
Yeah, so you've been working with some known techno DJs, which I actually quite like, Adam Beyer and Ida Embert. Actually went to see Adam Beyer last year. I'm a old school techno fan. Are they also interested in sustainability and psychedelics?
Well, Ida is definitely completely fascinated by ayahuasca and ecology, and wants to dedicate more and more of her energy and time to it. I mean, Adam, I think, is on a progressive path towards this. I mean, like the first thing that he's done is taken the festivals that he runs and then try to make them more clean, more sustainable, and so on. But yeah, I think that from my perspective, the way to take the regenerative future message and bring it to the masses would be through public influencers and musicians, making partnerships with them.
Are there any books you're working on at the moment, or you're planning to publish this year?
So I mean, unfortunately, like the economics of book writing and publishing are really terrible right now. So I've been self-publishing some stuff on Amazon, shorter things, but yeah, I don't have another plan for a major book right now. Yeah, just the last few experiences, I put so much time into these books, and financially it was not very rewarding. And because my books are more on the kind of I don't see myself. I mean, I guess I'm perceived as a thinker who's outside the mainstream because I'm willing to think about all these subject matters, and that's led the mainstream to kind of close off from me. So I can't get my books reviewed in the New York Times or the New Yorker or taken seriously in these types of mainstream organs. And if you can't do that, then you can't get on the talk shows and TV, and then you can't get your articles published in mainstream magazines. And then you really are closed off from that type of audience that then makes it sensible to publish a book the old-fashioned way. So at the moment, that part of my career is kind of in limbo. So I'm focusing on, I want to build a platform for these courses. And I also started a web magazine, liminal.news, with a friend, Jeremy Johnson. We're looking for content and so on. But yeah, I mean, personally, I just need to create a financially solvent base for myself. And then I would go back to sort of
Okay,
learn more
what
about
about like
and the thought
some of the
required.
books that you can recommend, the ones that you've read over the years? I know you read tons of books. If you would have to, you could maybe share a couple of titles that you found really, really good, really interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, once again, the starting place, I think, for me, obviously, would be my books. And my books also have extensive bibliographies of other books, but they also contextualize, the different ideas, 'cause I think, it's so hard to read a book these days. We really need to know why we're reading it. I mean, for me, like a book that was very valuable recently was called Dark Money by Jane Mayer, where she looks at the rich, the plutocrat, right-wing plutocrats who kind of decided in the 1960s that they wanted to move America in a different direction, away from social justice, civil liberties, and so on, and how they architected a plan over 40 years to shift the whole trajectory of the U.S. into this kind of oligarchic serf society, which they've now created. And it was very fascinating to see that they used all of the tools of trial and error, capitalist production, kind of creating social movements like the Tea Party, to really understand how they've engineered this takeover, this kind of fascist takeover of American society. So that's one that I would definitely recommend a lot, Dark Money. I find the works of this guy, Patrick Harper, are extremely powerful and very underread. He wrote a book called The Philosopher's Secret Fire, that's terrific. And Buckminster Fuller is always very valuable. Operation Spaceship Earth is a great book. Utopia or Oblivion, those were books that were very important to me.
Is there anything else you would like to share? Where people can find you?
Nope, not so much. Well, I mean, I have my own website, pinchbeck.io. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram under my name. We have this website, liminal.news, and regenerativefuture.net is where they can sign up for information about the course.
The coronavirus pandemic has shown us the fragility of our civilization. What do we do now? How do you fulfill your greatest potential and thrive in this new, fast-changing reality? Collectively, we know we have to make a transition to a regenerative system that is in harmony with the Earth. Local communities must become more resilient and self-reliant. Building Our Regenerative Future is a month-long intensive course that teaches the new skills and tools we all need to know now to make this shift. We examine the crucial macro trends in areas such as food, health, community, economics, culture, and consciousness. Building Our Regenerative Future presents a revolutionary new source code for the future of civilization and your own future.